Welcome to IPHA's Interprofessional Health Talks. It's focused on showcasing interprofessionalism through insightful discussions with various professionals and students within the health sector. We hope to expose students to different career paths and skill sets so that they can make more of an informed decision about their future. I'm Gobika.
And I'm Harneet. Our guest today is an audiologist who works at the Ottawa Hospital. Welcome, Arran. It's so great to have you here with us today.
Great. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. So I think we can jump into the questions right away. We want to ask you firstly, if you could walk us through what an audiologist is and your path to becoming one.
Sure. So an audiologist is a healthcare professional who identifies, assesses, and manages anything to do with the ears.
How did you decide that this was a career for you?
Well, when I was in university, I was doing an undergrad degree in physiology because I was really interested in that. But I was then trying to decide what I was going to do next with my career. I was looking around. I had a friend who was in speech pathology, and that looked really interesting. So I was looking into speech pathology, and through that found out about audiology, which to me appealed more because it seemed to be, at the time, more concrete.
We did do a little research on you. Many of our interprofessionals haven't worked abroad, but we did find out that you worked in New Zealand for 3 years. So what was your experience like?
That was incredibly interesting, I have to say. So when I was young and had been working for a few years, I did want to do some traveling. So I thought being able to work in another country would give me a good base to be able to travel. And I was lucky enough to get a job in New Zealand. So I moved there and was there I intended to go for a year and ended up staying for 2.5 years because I loved it so much.
So what does interprofessional look like within medicine, and what importance does it play in providing effective care?
Right. So audiologists can work relatively independently. If you've got an audiologist that's working, they have a private practice in the community. They may have, they get referrals from family physicians, or patients just come in, say, I feel like I have some hearing loss. They work with them. They may fit them with hearing aids. There's no other reason to refer them anywhere else, and they can work quite independently. However, there are audiologists that are involved with many different teams, and they help to provide collaboration and input into ensuring that the patient's care is optimized. Hearing loss is very under-recognized. It's one of the most common disabilities that exists in our society. Obviously, as we age, just through the aging process, hearing loss becomes a lot more common. And I think the impacts of hearing loss are often under-recognized. So audiologists often provide a lot of education to various teams that they may be a part of in terms of, trying to help the patients and families and the team members understand how the hearing loss may be impacting on other parts of their care.
I really enjoy that you touched on that. And to kind of solidify these concepts of interprofessionalism and audiology, we've got an interactive part coming up right now.
All right. So I'm going to go through a case study this is perhaps an interesting case that we saw at the Ottawa Hospital. So this is a cochlear implant patient that his name is Mr. H. He's male, and he was first referred to us in 2012 for cochlear implant assessment at age of 65. And he had rapidly deteriorating hearing over the last 10 years. And he's gotten to the point where hearing aids are offering very little benefit to him anymore. So he was seen by the audiologist for a cochlear implant assessment, where they do a detailed audiogram, a number of different types of word recognition testing. And they spend a lot of time talking about cochlear implants and educating the patient and the family. So his audiogram showed a bilateral, mild, sloping rapidly to a profound hearing loss. which means that in the if you think of a piano scale, so we need to hear a wide range of different tones or frequencies in order to be able to hear and understand all the different sounds of speech. So in his case, he had, for very low pitch tones, he had not too bad hearing, but his hearing really dropped off for medium and high frequency tones. So that would mean that he could still hear vowels, for example, like ooh, ah, but he couldn't hear consonants like S, F, sh, ch. So it's kind of like he had a filter. If you try to think of how it might have sounded for him, it's like he had a filter that was cutting out all the consonants and only letting him hear the vowels. So it'd be pretty hard to understand speech if all you heard was the vowels and no consonants. And his mid and high frequency hearing had deteriorated to the point where regular amplification from a hearing aid was just not strong enough to be able to provide him benefit. So he was a candidate for a cochlear implant, and the audiologist counseled Mr. H and his wife regarding the benefits and the drawbacks, the risks, and the process involved in obtaining a cochlear implant. So because of his poor hearing, we have various different ways that we work to communicate with patients with significant hearing loss, depending on their communication abilities. So it's always good to have a second set of ears. And because his wife is going to be such an integral part of the process, it's important that she understands what's going on as well. So we always encourage family to come to these appointments. And with Mr. H, we can by a combination of his speech reading and written communication. So often we will type what we're saying on the computer, or now we often dictate because there's such good speech. I don't know what the word is, transcription just via speech, and it comes up on the computer. So we often use that now. Yeah. So he had his surgery with the ENT surgeon. And the audiologist actually goes to the operating room, speaks with the patient beforehand to make sure that everything's good. While the patient is in surgery and their flap is open, the implant has been inserted, the audiologist comes into the OR and actually tests the device in situ to make sure it's working. And then once they determine the device is working, then the surgeon goes ahead and closes it up and finishes the operation. The patient then sees the ENT physician about several weeks after for follow-up to make sure the incision's healing well and for suture removal. And in this particular case, Mr. H had his initial activation about 6 weeks after the surgery. So with the initial activation of the implant, it's going to be the first time that they're hooking up the external piece of the implant to the internal piece, and the audiologist is going to program or map the device. So it can be quite interesting because for some patients it can be overwhelming because they haven't heard much in a long time, and it can sound very different. Some people have described it as sounding like Donald Duck talking underwater. So the sound isn't going to be exactly the same as what you remember the sound to be before. These devices don't give back normal hearing, but they give access to a lot more hearing than they had before. So it does take time and practice and patience and perseverance to really learn how to hear again with a cochlear implant. So he would have come for a number of different appointments over the next few weeks, and he would give a lot of feedback to the audiologist, who would then adjust the mapping, adjust the programming in the implant to make it more comfortable, to help emphasize certain frequencies of sound over others, depending on what his feedback is. So he found after a few weeks he was hearing much better overall. He attended several social functions, was feeling more relaxed and less stressed because he was much more connected to his environment from a hearing perspective. But after, a few months, he kind of felt like his progress was stalling. He'd kind of gotten as far as he felt he could go. And he still, was not hearing, he was hearing much better than before, but he was not doing that fantastic. So we were running a study at the time that was looking at the benefits of a type of auditory rehabilitation called auditory verbal therapy for adult cochlear implant patients. Normally, auditory verbal therapy is a type of specialized type of therapy that is typically offered for kids with hearing loss to help them really learn to hear and identify sounds of speech, and to work on the hearing side and the speech production side. So it's kind of almost like a combination of very specialized speech language pathology and audiology. So what was very interesting, one of the benefits we found from this study was that the AVT therapist was very helpful to the audiologist in terms of mapping the cochlear implant to help better enable the patients and Mr. H to discriminate different sounds. So there's some sounds that are hard to discriminate with hearing aids or cochlear implants, like the difference between R and L and W, for example. So the auditory verbal therapist knew specifically which sounds he was having difficulty with in terms of discrimination. And then she would sit with the audiologist and the patient, and they would adjust the mapping so that it would help him be able to acquire the cues he needed to distinguish those different types of those different sounds from each other to improve his overall speech discrimination. So that was very, very helpful to have those two professionals work together like that. The other thing was that many cochlear implant patients don't use the phone. They have a phone for texting and email, but they don't use the phone acoustically. So the auditory verbal therapist worked with many of the patients in the study, including Mr. H, and got them to the point where they had the confidence and the ability to be able to use the telephone. Some patients would just use the telephone with immediate family. But others, got good enough and heard well enough on the phone that they could, talk with complete strangers on the phone and be able to hear them. So it was very beneficial, I have to say. So overall, Mr. H, through obtaining the cochlear implant, through working with the audiologist, the ENT surgeon, the nurse in the clinic, and the auditory verbal therapist, he experienced a significant improvement in the quality of life, in his quality of his life, and his ability to communicate and participate in his life. It can be a long process, and it's a big commitment, but he's doing really well now.
What advice would you give to students that are hoping to follow a similar career path to yours?
I would, as with any career, do your research. If you can do some observation, or better yet, volunteer work with an audiology clinic, whether it be in the community or children's hospital or adult hospital or anything like that, just to get a good idea about what the field is like, and if this is really something that you want to get into, that's always good advice.
And so we've come to the conclusion of this interview, but before we finish, would you like to add anything else?
Just that audiology for me has been an incredibly rewarding career. It's given me the opportunity to travel, to work in other countries, work with fantastic teams of other professionals and my own audiology and speech pathology teams. I would, if this is the right career for somebody, I would definitely recommend it for them. And it's incredibly rewarding to help people to communicate and hear better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Definitely. So, Arran, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. It's been so great, and I think we've all learned so much. And I'm guessing the audience will also learn just as much from you. Also, thank you to the audience for everyone tuning in to another episode of Interprofessional Health Talks. We hope that you've enjoyed this episode as much as we have. And as always, you can find us at Ottawa IPHA on all of our social platforms. Have a wonderful week. Arran, thank you.